Welcome to How to Trust Your Intuition, the podcast, the place where we learn that trust is earned and not given, even with ourselves. I'm your host, Betsy LeFae. I'm a social worker, turned award-winning psychic medium, turned intuition teacher. And my school, Trust Yourself Intuition School, celebrated its 10th anniversary in 2023. Join us each episode as we interview thought leaders and luminaries in every genre. They talk about how and when they learn to trust their intuition. Most say they're still learning. What happens when they do trust it and what happens when they don't. Stick around as we all walk together down the road towards trusting our intuition. Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of How to Trust Your Intuition. On today's show, we have Lauree Ostrofsky. Lauree helps career-minded introverts and A students clarify their next leap and feel more confident putting themselves out there. She's the author of the how-to, Simply Leap, and the memoir, I'm Scared and Doing It Anyway. Great titles, both of those books. I'm Scared and Doing It Anyway is about her own leaps after a brain tumor diagnosis at age 28. She's a hugger, people connector, and authentically awkward and anxious, like so many of us doing business differently. I had a blast talking to Lauree today, and she really did blow me away when she answered the question, what happened when she didn't trust herself and the result? Stick around to the end because you're going to hear something that I hope you all get out of your seats and cheer as much as I did when I heard what happened when she finally broke her unhealthy relationship patterns that I think most of us can relate to. Enjoy the interview. Well, welcome everyone to the show, Lauree. Welcome. It's such an honor to have you here.
Oh, it is such an honor to be here with you. I was psyched about our conversation before and even more psyched to make it live with everyone.
Yay. And so what do you do for work? What do you want people to know about you?
Yeah, so I think the first thing I want to know, I just lost my thing. Hopefully you can still hear me. The first thing I want people to know is that I am an awkward introvert, and that I am that as myself day to day, and I project out into the world someone who has more is an A student who has figured things out, who does things well, and as a coach, as a consultant for businesses on how you're marketing and using social media. I coach mainly women on their leaps. So whether it's a career related, moving more meaningfully through their corporate career, or designing and growing their own businesses. I work with A student women, and most of us are secretly worried about being awkward and introverted. So we have that kind of secret, I think, superpower that we have in common, and I love doing that as well. I'm also an author and a speaker, and I love connecting with people. So I'm thrilled to be talking about it today.
All right. I love how you mentioned A+ a couple of times, and it's in your bio, so people have heard that. But that's one of the things I want to touch on, because that an A+ student, especially in the fully formed adult world, it says so freaking much, so much. And I could be wrong, and there could be so many different iterations of this, but with the A+ student, it says so much. What comes to mind for me, and I could be missing a lot of things here, I kind of see A+ student in like two categories. I see A+ from a perspective of more of like a perfectionist driven way, and then I see it more from a people pleasing way, and they could be from both. But when I say perfectionist, I think of people in my life who their perfectionism doesn't have to do with pleasing other people in the same way as like, oh, I got to bring home an A for other people. It's almost like with the perfectionism that sometimes gets in the way of pleasing other people because they need to have it their way. So I'm not assuming you only work with one type of A+ student, but could you talk about that a little bit and the differences or similarities that you see with the people that you work with?
Yeah, it's interesting. I have never thought about those two, um, the dichotomy there, and I'm so curious about it now. Now I'm thinking about it more, but I want to say first how I describe the A students that I work with,
That's great.
and myself among them, which is that we were really comfortable in third grade. So third grade, you had the rules listed in construction paper on the board and knew what they were. They were right there in front of you. You knew what was required to get that gold star or that A, that acceptance, that praise. There's the people pleasing, that praise. Like we knew what was required,
And you
and
knew
there,
if you were doing it right based on that feedback.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And so there's structure in that, and structure creates a lot of safety, especially if other things don't feel safe. And we
Mhm.
could talk about childhood and whatever else is going on in our worlds, but there is safety in a classroom in terms of rules, especially in the younger years in elementary school. It's like very clear. And as we age, things are never as clear. And I find that when I work with A students, we're kind of wishing there was more structure.
Mhm.
You know, I talk about liking when I go to the dentist and they say, "Oh, I can tell you've been flossing," and I'm like, "I did it. I knew exactly what was required for this situation, and I did it." And so I guess that would be more of the people pleasing. I need some kind of external validation, but I get that it also can be, there is this perfect, there's perfection that we're moving towards. I guess I work more with the people pleasing,
That would make sense. Yeah.
externally focused folks.
Yeah, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, there are perfection. I don't actually believe there's people that are perfectionists. I think it's they value perfectionism, which isn't really necessarily a real thing. But I would think in general, those that side of the spectrum doesn't necessarily look for help from a coach. It's sort of that thing. The thing about the rules and structure, and especially in adulthood, not having that. Um, one is a comment, one's a question. So the comment is that, like, um, my audience knows that I've been involved in various cults. I was raised in one. Now I'm no longer in them. And the reason why cults have always been popular, and our awareness of that is increasing a lot of times, is because people want to know what to do and sometimes what to think so that they know they're being safe. If we just take like a very easy example, dogmatic religion, right? Like, if the priest tells me to pray and to go to church, then I'm going to get into heaven. Great, done. I know I'm getting that gold star. And so when they go to improve themselves and they have this nice setup of rules and steps and everything like that, that gives them a lot of comfort, but it also takes away their free will and their freedom, and brainwashing. So that's just a comment there. My question is, when you're helping, so let's just say the example of the woman who comes to you and she's like thinking about starting her own business, and maybe you can tell intuitively, like, oh, she's totally meant for this, if, and I mean she would do well in this, isn't that? Do you work on creating more structures, more personal structures for people? Is that one of the things that you do?
I would say most of the time, um, the the individuals that show up, one of the things that they'll reflect to me almost immediately is, if I knew what I wanted to do, I'd be doing it already. I know how to write a resume. I know how to build things. I know how to figure things out. I know how to make a plan. A students tend to know how to do that. They have their study plan. They've bought their notebook. They're gonna go down the road. But if they don't know which way to go this time, like for instance, I usually work with folks kind of mid-career. So they've had enough doors open in front of them that they've walked through. Um, and then they get to either a point where they don't want to go through the door that's just opened. They don't know which one, or the path they've been on doesn't feel as meaningful as they'd like it to be now.
Mhm.
They've been disillusioned by it in some way, by the corporate world, the work that they've been doing, there's a lot of should that perhaps have shown up, like I should be this way or I should do something. And they reach a point where it's like, okay, well, I know it's probably not that thing that's right in front of me, but it's always been clear in the past. So I'm not sure how to figure out when it's not clear this time.
Mm.
Um, and so I would say that's the majority of people that show up, that the clients that I end up working with. And some of it is putting a plan into place, like the structure. I would say more of it is learning to trust our instincts
Yeah.
and learning to feel more confident in ourselves, being
Mm-hmm.
kinder to ourselves,
Mm-hmm.
and being more willing to experiment. The potential of getting something wrong is pretty
Mm.
high. The
A
anxiety
plus
and worry
students,
about
yeah.
getting something wrong is high, especially as you go further along in your career, your business, and your life. There's like more depending on you. There are more people depending on you, and so it can feel really lonely. Like you're at this point, you're like, oh, that's too tenuous here for me to get something wrong. And so we together create a lot of space for experimentation. You're going to research, you're going to remember things that you like to do, and learn and reconnect with the parts of you that that you can trust
Mm-hmm.
more over time, to then be able to know when something shows up, when a new door opens, like, oh, that's the door.
Mm-hmm.
Because if we don't have enough internal trust and confidence and self-knowledge, it's really hard to tell which door or which opportunity is the right one presented in front of
Mm-hmm.
us. So it's not necessarily going out and getting more of those. It's that internal trust.
That's absolutely beautiful. Before this interview, I walked outside to get some fresh air. I ran into my neighbor, and he knows that I try to get my 10,000 steps in every day. He's also a spiritual entrepreneur. And he's like, "Well, how long is that?" I'm like, "It's about 3 miles." And he's like, "Oh, okay." And I was like, something about like, "Do you plan it?" And like, we both kind of chuckled. I was like, he's like, "I've never had a plan that worked out." And I was like, when I first had this idea, I like put it on the map and I was like, okay, how far do I have to walk? And now I go out when I have a break. I go where my intuition takes me. It doesn't matter if I walk by the same coffee shop 5 times in a row. And I was like afraid of being seen. Like, there's that redheaded lady. She just passed here 4 times already. And I'm like, it doesn't really matter. Using sort of that as an analogy, I'm just kind of curious, like whether it be for your clients or for yourself, that dance between structure and intuition. Because I found in my own life, whether it be business or personal care or whatever, that I have this sort of outline, or they are boundaries and rules, but they're not super strict. And I'll be like, okay, this, and then I sort of flow in between all of that. I know I will never forget, as I wouldn't say A plus student, but I'd say like almost A plus student. Like, I've had to tell myself in those times of being really uncertain or changing something and being afraid to fail, of like, you will never forget what is most important. Like, you will not forget to pay the bills or whatever if you go on this sort of, journey or whatever. So for you, or for the people that you work with, is that sort of something that you wind up getting to, the structure
Yeah,
and flowing?
absolutely. Well, and exactly what you were just saying, that they've already established some of that structure and some of that, and I would say in a different word than that, like um, they have already have the ability to take good care of themselves, just like what you were saying. They know how to pay the bills. Their worst case scenario is survivable
Mhm.
and thrivable already. And so sometimes we talk about what their worst case scenario is when they're trying something new. Because
Mhm.
what you're saying is, if I've always paid my bills, or if I've always had that in mind, I'm going to as well with this.
Mhm.
I'm not, it's not completely, it may be different than what I've done before, but I'm still me, and
Mhm.
recognizing that I still have these either core values or beliefs or these core skills that I'm going to apply. There's some comfort in that, and we recognize that we have that inside ourselves.
Mhm.
It's really important, and I think our culture and tends to say external sources of that are, are what we're supposed to depend on. But I think our work, you and I, we have in common that it's like, oh no, actually, probably our own self work is
Mhm.
about that, and the work that we do with others is kind of reflecting that, and in their journeys reflecting then back to us, like, oh right, this is, yeah, we already know, we're good.
Yeah. I definitely do that with myself. I have done that with myself in the past when I've been overwhelmed, like what's the worst case scenario? And that's what I help my students and my clients with, especially with these big transitions of like, okay, what is your biggest fear? I have them go into detail about it. And then I'm like, do you really feel like you will be homeless on the street in a box? I mean, that could be a reality for some people, but then they have an inner knowing, like, no, that won't ever happen to me. Okay, great. So let's explore all the different avenues. It does take away some of the weight of that fear when you do talk out your biggest fear. It's like
Yeah.
into the bed that there's no monster there. There's
Yes, yes, but we have to actually look under the bed first to have that.
mm,
Our thought of something is often scarier or more uncomfortable than the reality of it. And I would say one big example of that is money. Money comes up a lot. I can't possibly leave this job or start a new business or whatever, or try this new thing, and potentially, lose money or something. And most people I find haven't even looked at their finances before they've had that fear and made decisions based on it. So it's a good number of times with clients. It's like, have you had a money date? Have you looked at your bank account every day for the last week? Do you check it regularly? Have you seen how things are doing, and how, how much money you have to pay bills, like a, rainy day fund and all of that? It's like when people look at it, they feel more empowered. Just
mhm,
like everything else that we've said, I feel like money is a big one because, again, it can feel like this external thing, this monster in the closet, and looking at it, even if it's not a great number,
mhm,
at least means it's your number and you get to do something about it.
mhm.
So yeah, I feel like that's one of those big ones.
If I was in that position, I would definitely want you holding my hand throughout all of that. And I think it's a really, not that we're closing the conversation, but I think it is a really nice sort of conclusion because it is something else that I gave an example about in class when we're talking about worst case scenario. If you had a kid, no matter what age, they woke up in the middle of the night and they came to you and they're like, there's a monster under my bed. Hopefully, if you were a healthy parent, you would hear them. You would validate, I see you're scared. Thank you for coming to me. And in my opinion, I would go in there with a flashlight and be like, hey, let's look together. I'll look first if you're too scared, and then let's look together and we see that no monster is there. And I would imagine it would put the kid at ease, barring any extreme examples. So doing that with ourselves, I think, is really important and really, really healthy and helpful. So I'm glad that you're doing that work. I'd love to transition to the questions, and we did read this in the bio in the beginning, but I'm very curious about you coming into your intuition, learning to trust it, and all of that. And I'm curious if there's any connection either in time or just in concept to, you had a brain tumor at 28, is that right? Yeah.
Yeah.
So if that had anything to play into, of course, and that was also the Saturn return as well. So we've got that mixed in there.
Yeah. Oh, that was my Saturn when that
Yeah.
happened. Right. And when that happened. Yeah. 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 And that's when I learned about Saturn return. I think most people do at those points. Yes, actually, you were kind enough to share some questions in advance, and that really is the answer of like, when did I learn to trust my intuition? And I would say that I when I've talked about my brain tumor, and I'm happy to share a bit about it, it was more that I recognized how much power we all have to affect major change in our lives. And that even without getting too woo-woo about it, it really is how we think about something, how we talk about it, who we surround ourselves with, um, how we treat ourselves while something is happening. And those were all of the things that happened during this time. So at 28, I was very much an A student. I was living and working in Manhattan. My parents loved my boyfriend. I had a 401k, and I was climbing the corporate ladder like a good A student. And I was,
100%. You got 100% that.
yes. And I was pretty unhappy. I really felt like I didn't want to keep working in the marketing world that I was in. I still do marketing now, but it feels very different. But at that time I was an agent at an agency, and just because it was what made everybody else proud, I could see who my bosses, like what my bosses' lives were like. And I was like, I don't want anything to do with that. But I didn't know what the next thing was. And it turned out that I had the day that I was going to give notice, and I had saved enough pennies to give notice, was the day that I had a doctor's appointment, luckily right before I was going to meet with my boss. And at that appointment, I thought I had an ear infection. I'd never had an ear infection before, but I thought that's what it was. And turns out I had an acoustic neuroma brain tumor. And that was the moment in the doctor's office when they did the whole MRI screen with the blob that was clearly not meant to be in my brain. And it was, it was that moment that nobody wants. So many of us have experienced, where the path we think we're on, the control we think we have, is suddenly and irrevocably changed. And I spent the next 4 months, luckily it was slow growing. I spent the next 4 months kind of fighting with and hoping that somehow this wasn't true.
Right.
That I could run away from it. I could try all of the alternative methods possible, that, I could wake up in the morning and suddenly there would be some other answer. And then 4 months later, actually, we are at my anniversary. So this month is oh my gosh, my 19th anniversary. Yeah, so next year is 20 years. So 19th anniversary of my first surgery. And I had 3 surgeries about meningitis. I lost my hearing and my balance in my right ear. That's where the acoustic neuroma is behind your inner ear. It took me a number of months to get healthy again. I feel really lucky that I did. And but what I learned, there was just a really pivotal moments that happened in the hospital and in the ICU that really showed me there are things that we think we have control over and that we don't. There's a lot. And I think the pandemic also was a big wake up call for most of us, like, oh crap, things I think I have control over. No. Um, and yet there are things we do have control over. We have control over how we think about something, how we talk about it, right? What's in our minds and in our hearts, and how we express it, and how we hold ourselves. Exactly, the shining the light under the bed. If we can be that kind to ourselves, it goes a really long way. And so those were the things that I learned. And I feel like that was the moment that, to go back to your original question, that was the moment that connected me to intuition, what to trust, and more deeply where that is in me, as opposed to this kind of general concept that didn't. I needed something concrete, like this incredible experience, to really connect me with it.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, when I was 28, I fell from a flight of stairs onto my head, and they found a hole in my spinal cord near my C2 vertebrae. So this is not the
Oh my God.
showing, but it's like it's wildly parallel to like the
Yeah.
same year. We've got the brainstem, the brain, like,
Oh my God.
working in a social worker career, not going to do anything else for the rest of my life. So I just want to ask a question about what you said, though. So you went to the doctor first before you were going to hand in your notice. Did you hand in your notice then, or were you staying in your job while you were healing?
Yeah. So what happened was I had that doctor's meeting. I remember taking a cab back, I was in Manhattan, taking a cab to the office after, like, dazed, and getting a chocolate bar. Chocolate is always my comfort. I was like, I need a chocolate bar right now, and not saying anything, canceling my meetings with my bosses.
Yeah.
And it turns out that I had the best health insurance I could ever have had. Just so happened, of course, not coincidentally. And also not coincidentally, when I finally told, probably within a few days, told my bosses that the woman who ran my company, her husband had passed away from a brain tumor a year prior. I had met him. And the next day after I had told her and my bosses, who are also all women, so it's so interesting. I'm working with women now too. But on my desk the next day was the New York magazine with the top doctors, like, opened. This is how you knew that my boss was like, you always ended up with something on your desk in the morning with it circled. She's old school that way. And so on my desk was her doctor in New York, magazine, circled, like, this is the one that you should talk to. And she and I are still in touch these, 20 years later, because there's, as you just said about your own experience at 28, there are things that connect us. And how incredible is that day when I was about to, I knew that I needed to move on. The universe or whomever was like, well, you are, but not quite today.
Yeah.
And we're going to support you in this transition, because I had incredible, like, this health insurance doesn't exist anymore. I think it was like a $50,000 and per surgery. And I think I paid $1,000 total for all 3 surgeries.
Wow.
So, and I had this boss that really understood from such a deep level, that, anyway, I feel so lucky about it. But I made it through, or I had a leave of absence. And when medically they couldn't, they had to end leave of absence, but I wasn't really physically ready to commute and things. I gave notice then, with lots of support from them.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. That is such a fantastic story. Thank you for sharing that. It's interesting that health insurance comes up, because I know in my work, even with me personally, that was a big, when we talk about just what we've been talking about, like A+ student, and I've got to switch, but I don't know what I want to switch to. The deciding factor was a lot of health insurance. That was the one thing that my family, society was like, if you go on your own, you're going to die because you won't have health insurance. When I graduated with a BA in psychology in 2002, attachment work was only applied to children. Now, in 2023, it seems to be all the rage for a reason. Because knowing your attachment type, there are 3 main types: avoidant, anxious, and secure, really changes your life. And if you listen to the podcast where I talked about how I lost $100,000 from a spiritual, quote unquote, spiritual coach, the silver lining to that experience was me discovering the root of a lot of my issues. I was anxiously attached. I had anxious attachment. At the very end of that terrible, terrible situation, yes, it was traumatic, I came across Maya Diamond's work. And it was working through her program that literally rewired my brain from anxious to secure. This is how I made it through all of my major transitions over the past 2 years and discovered so much about myself. Now, if you don't know about attachment work, don't feel bad. Here's a typical situation, in fact, the most common situation that happens with these attachment styles. Person A and person B are in a relationship. They care about one another. Person A reaches out to person B, doesn't hear back right away. So then maybe sends another text or another gesture, which further pushes person B away. Both people get resentful, and eventually they might break up. I was in that situation more often than I'd like to remember. I married the wrong person, I had toxic family relationships, and had no idea until I took Maya's program. So, the link for a free consultation is in the show notes, and I'm so happy to offer it all the podcast listeners. If you sign up for her program, you will get a free session worth $500 with Maya Diamond herself, one-on-one. That's just for How to Trust Your Intuition podcast listeners. So when you did put in your notice, were any of those fears coming up for you?
Oh, for sure. For sure. Yeah, well, health insurance has been a big, after you have a medical thing, I had never paid attention to medical insurance before. Suddenly I was reading, I was reading whatever the document said. Yeah, so I did pay attention to health insurance. I had Cobra, in the whatever they had extended the Cobra for me, which was really nice. And so I had it for like, I don't know, a year or something. Back then the payments were okay. I don't know if today's Cobra payments are as good. They can be pretty debilitating financially. And then and then what happened was I was I was pretty good for a while on health insurance, and then it was a couple years before the Affordable Care Act had happened, but we knew that it was going to. It was
it was a
like,
long period.
Yeah, they're really pushing it through,
years,
right?
Yeah.
And I was like, I really need this to happen because I work for myself, and if they know my and that you need a certain number of years, so it's like past 10 years, they actually don't look back and see what you've had medically.
Okay.
But I wasn't at that mark yet. I was just like, so I remember buying a hit by a bus medical insurance policy, which is basically humongous deductible. Like, it's like, okay, I can pay that number if I had to, but basically I'm not going to see, I'm luckily healthy. Otherwise I'm not going to the doctor until hopefully this Affordable Care Act happens and I can go. And in the meantime, I'm going to buy something. And so, I mean, we're in New York State and it's great here. I happen to be living just outside of DC on the Maryland side. They had decent health. So I could talk a lot about that, but I've thought about it a lot. But because I bought that policy, I feel like I never believe that I'm an adventurous person. I've had that compliment before, and I compliment my clients with it because as an A student, that doesn't really say adventure. Usually it's like I have to, but I am an adventurous person who likes a few key things in place that allow me to, as I think as you've described as well, to kind of flow between those areas. If I know I have a few things that make me feel safe, like I have this policy, and so I'm gonna hope I don't get it, strep throat the next year. And this other thing, but I'm covered if something really terrible happens. That's enough for me to feel like I can go. And that was the year that I went 100% into my business. And I think that's enough. I think we have to recognize what are a couple of the safe things that we need, and still allow ourselves the permission to try and experiment and flow, as you would say. So yeah.
I just think it's a good it's a great discussion, but I think it's a good reminder for anyone in that position who's like, I can't change jobs because I won't have health insurance. Catastrophic is a good intermittenary thing. And then depending on where you are, urgent care and stuff like that usually is actually pretty affordable. in
Hmm.
terms of like, I haven't been paying in premiums for the whole year, and I have this one $300 bill from having like a UTI or something, you know.
Right.
It's just,
Right.
it's a little bit shining the light underneath the bed for people, being like, hey, there's actually some solutions here. Thank you for
Yeah, for
sharing that.
sure.
So, can you tell us about a time when you trusted your intuition, perhaps despite logic, where it didn't necessarily logically make sense?
Yeah. So I mentioned that I lived in DC, just outside and on the Maryland side, but I I was I was married. I got divorced when I was living in New York. I moved to DC to start my new life. I also went 100% into the business I now run, and um, and I published my first book in March 2013. And I was really excited. And I thought, so I self published and I thought, real book authors go on media tours, go on
Mhm.
book tours. I'm like, well, my background's in marketing. I'm sure I can figure this out. I've never worked for an author before. I'm sure I can figure this out. And so I had this kind of, and I was also getting out of another relationship at that time. And I was like, I think it would be really good for me to go out into the world, kind of put together a book tour and leave DC and leave this relationship and the physical location of this for a while. And this was mid-May, 2013. And I was like, yep, I think this is time. I immediately heard from I mentioned it to a friend of mine, and she's like, oh, I'm leaving my apartment in New York for a month in June. Do you want to, if you want, I need somebody there to like water my plants. I'm like, interesting timing. And I asked my landlord, hey, can I let go of my apartment a month early if I find or 2 months early if I find a replacement? And basically, all of this happened within 2 weeks.
Mm.
The first person who looked at my apartment took it. I had set up a 6 month tour of friends that I was going to see and stay with on their couches. Like, okay, all I need to do is get there. And then I can figure out how to, like, the first few things. I'm going to stay at her apartment in New York. I'm going to fly here next. Like, I knew the next couple things. But it was that 2 week period in DC where I had this sense of like, I think it's time to go. And if I could just say, the person who showed up to look at my apartment the first time was this young woman, totally an A student. Oh my God, totally an A student, and her mom, which was really adorable. And I showed her my apartment and I was like, oh, by the way, do you like any of the furniture? And because I'm looking to sell that too, I'm just going to get rid of everything. She's like, they look at each other, they look at me, and they're like, we like all of your furniture. And so she came back to pay me for my furniture in addition to taking the apartment. And then she said, can I buy 2 copies of your book? One is I'd like you to sign it for my mom because it's her birthday. She's just gone through cancer and she's really inspired by your story. And the other book I want to keep here in the place where you wrote it.
Wow.
And I was like, I am, and I kept saying to people, I said to my parents, I don't know why I'm supposed to go, but clearly I am supposed to go
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
because these things wouldn't line up in this way
Yep.
so clearly if I wasn't meant to take the next step.
Mm-hmm. 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 I love that. That is amazing. I really thought that the story was going to go different, where like, I have to do this book tour, but I'm an introvert and I really don't want to. And that
Oh,
I
yes,
thought you
there's
were going to
that.
like cancel it or something, but no, that's great. That's really, really
No, I
great.
had the intuition. I got to get out of here. I got to leave this.
Exactly. And you're like, I don't know why, which is the logic. It's like the logic doesn't say like, oh yeah, you should totally do this. It's amazing. I'm so that oh, I want to keep a book here where you wrote it. Like that's just that gave me chills.
I know. I know. It totally did me too. I
Yeah.
just will forever just love that moment so much.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, how about not following your intuition and the result?
Yeah. Um, s- so these kind of are in a category of things because and it's usually around, it's been in the past around dating
Mhm.
where, because that relationship that ended when I left town, I then had kind of smaller versions of that same relationship. A couple, the next couple people I dated were like that guy again, which
Mhm.
are totally unhealthy relationships with me, guys who were not emotionally available. And I was trying to fit myself into what I thought they needed me to be, having already just had this big event, this incredible 6-month tour that I put together myself and, all this stuff. And it's like, why am I shrinking myself again? And the part about it that's related to my intuition is that in all three cases, I had this like, gosh, this doesn't feel right to me. I feel this feeling again, which is less than, which is small,
Mhm.
which is in a box. I'm putting myself in this box. And um and I had the sense to break it off, and then got back together with them
Yes.
consecutively. And I was like, ah.
You're all ready for your vacation. It's really hectic getting here, but you're seated in your airplane seat, looking out the window, and you hear the pilot come on the intercom. Good day, everyone. It's a beautiful day outside, 71 and sunny. As you're aware, to get to where we're going, we need to fly over that mountain range, and sometimes there can be a little bit of turbulence. I'm about 80% sure we'll get there safely. So buckle up, relax, and enjoy your flight. I know that sounds like an absurd situation, but when I put this in context of trusting yourself and trusting your intuition, and I ask people on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being the most, how much do you trust yourself? 8 is a very high score when asking people. So if you fall on a 2 to 4 range, you're totally not alone. Now picture this other scenario. You're out to lunch with a friend, and the friend says that they've been having a really difficult time learning French. You ask the logical question, are you taking a class? And their answer is, well, I'm taking Spanish. Guess what? If you want to trust yourself deeply, if you want to have an easier time making decisions, break through blocks, connect with people, know who to connect with when, there's a class for that. I've actually helped thousands of people truly trust themselves in uncertainty, in times of doubt or fear, shame or guilt. And I have a free masterclass called Intuition 101, How to Trust Yourself in Uncertain Times, that will tell you everything you need to know in order to learn to trust yourself. The link is in the show notes. However, you can also go to howtotrustyourintuition.com, all spelled out.
So I don't know if that's actually
Oh, that's
answers your
great. I
question, but
mean,
I feel like it's not trusting myself.
yeah, you're not the only person on the show who said something like that. For me and all the people I've helped, I feel like matters of romance and also of food tend to be sort of the last frontiers for people to really discern and trust and follow through with. But the fact that you recognize those feelings of like, why do I feel small? I mean, of course, I'm always reflecting on my own story as I'm listening. And I was like, oh, yeah, I know that box. Like that box, that box is, there's one way to say it, which is not the whole truth, but that box is so familiar that it feels like home and it feels safe, but it's not. It doesn't
Yes.
actually feel safe, but that's the feeling that I had growing up. That was the closest I had to feeling safe. I remember what brought up for me was like the last relationship I was in was very short. and we were out somewhere, and I just caught myself saying like, oh, don't worry, when we're out in the future, I said like something that was like directly like, I will make myself small, I will not da 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 da, like, and I didn't know at the time, and I was like, oh right, like that's that. Luckily, that's my version of like, oh, we were in person for 2 weeks, distance for two, so it was only a month. And then I realized, which is I'm very, very proud of myself for that. What, and now you're in a healthy partnership. Just, you don't have to be brief, but I just like to hear a little bit about like maybe the feelings or realizations, whether they be comforting or shocking, of like you're used to someone having a life that makes you feel small in the partnership, and then you come across this person who doesn't. So to me, that would feel, it feels like it could be a little disorienting, or like, really, wait, what, like, oh, I'm getting an A for this, like what? Like,
Yeah.
what were some of
Yeah,
the
you
things
set the bar low, buddy.
right, like what, well, yeah, exactly, what were some of those things that went through your head now that you're in a healthy one?
Yeah. Okay, so I don't know if you or your listeners have a love of Pride and Prejudice and Jane Austen, but I am a really big fan of Colin Firth and his like very proud, steely, like not and so I was and that also is very indicative of my growing up life. It was pretty strict and the box. And so I was kind of dating those guys. And Damon, who I'm with now, is a really happy guy. He is Bingley. He's Bingley, if you're a Pride and Prejudice fan. Anyway, like really nice guy, really happy, thrilled about everything, and thinks I'm great, not having done anything. Like to start, I'm already interesting. And I thought in the beginning, I was just like, well, if I don't have to work at this, what the hell is the point? How do I judge if this is going well? Because the only way I can judge if a relationship is working, even a friendship, for God's sake, is if I've worked at it and I've proven something or they've come around. And so I was like, oh, actually, this is a really good sign because he sees and appreciates me. I'm allowed to kind of move around and figure stuff out. And there's a lot of space for me to do that. And space is also uncomfortable. Space to be like, oh, I can change. Oh, you don't have a requirement here. So that, yeah. So I would say discomfort. Well, okay. The thing I've also learned about previous relationships is when, that heart fluttering is actually your body saying that you're allergic to this and you should move away. And so the discomfort I felt with Damon was not this, I can barely breathe around him. I was like, this is really different. I don't know if I know how to deal with different, or is different good? I don't know. And that not knowing, I allowed myself to keep going in the relationship to kind of let that unfold, let that not knowing unfold, and that newness and that difference unfold for me to understand better why this was different, what I was learning about myself as a result.
You literally gave me exactly what I wanted. A plus, Lauree. A plus. The way you described it is such a healing balm to me. Again, coming from extreme situations, I was reading a book. I think it's called Psychopath Free. Really, really good book. And one of the things they do is they say, I forget what word they use, but like, who is your constant, or who's a person in your life who basically doesn't judge you, who gives you the space. A lot of the ways that you were describing it And I was really lucky because when I was reading it, I didn't have anyone that loved me unconditionally, like at all. Maybe my grandmother, she's deceased. You can still work with that. But then they're like, well, how about maybe you have a pet or something like that? And I was like, yes, my cat. She sees me the way Damien sees you. She's,
Yeah.
sometimes she's hungry and I don't feed her fast enough, but that's about it. Even if I step on her toes by accident, she forgives me right away. And I think that it's just good for anyone who's making that shift or who wants to make that shift, that it does feel foreign and feels weird when you first come across it. And I have to say, I mean, I clapped silently when you said it, but that fluttering in your heart it's your intuition saying, get away from this person. I can speak for myself. Uh, that is akin to what I would have with my caregivers, right? So that's why I was attracted to it. And I met someone, and like when you meet someone or have an experience unexpectedly, you're in the moment, all this, like, I feel like you even know where this is going. And I'm like, she's feeding me like what is exactly gonna happen. So we had a nice conversation. We had a lot in common. And I can say now in hindsight, I had that, but I still am in the place where I'm rewiring. I'm working secure attachment style, which means I'm anxious, but I do the tools and then I'm secure. And so we asked each other if we wanted to go to coffee over DMs. And they were like, well, I'm not free. And then I was like, all right. So when I reached out again, and I noticed something that they had put on their social media. And I just like, it was like, what? I don't know what this is making me feel. This is really strange. And I have to say, the way it made me feel from the social media was that gigantic heart swell. And I had enough awareness to know that like whatever was happening was what I was used to, but didn't feel good. And this was just a video they put on social media for everyone. So I brought it to my therapist and she made this like really weird face. I was like, you got it. And then we worked it out, which I'll talk about what we worked out. But then later on, I showed it to my friend and I even muted it. And my friend was like immediately like recoiled and was like, what? I was like, what? And my friend called it snake charming. My friend was like, oh, that's a snake charmer. And I was like, oh, I didn't have a word for it. My therapist was talking about male gaze and female gaze, and you don't have to be of that gender. And then it can be very manipulative. And I'd like to know more about that. I just haven't looked into it. But, sometimes if you want to be a musician or influencer, sometimes you might work an audience like that, and that's part of your job. But you and I are the faces of our brand, and we're not looking lovingly into the camera and being like, I see you. Like we're just like it's creepy for me even to do. And so I was so glad that we never actually met up, and then I had slowed down enough. That's what I need to do, and I think in general a lot of people need to do in those. It's like really slow down, even if you're not an introvert. Take lots of time away, talk to friends, talk to your therapist about little things. And I can say I'm very proud of myself for this, because in the past, being with gaslighters and abusers and all of that, I was taught and also self-taught, regulated, that you don't share the things that make you uncomfortable because you might feel ashamed or it might bring shade to that person and you don't want to do that. So the fact that I had these feelings and I brought them up right away and then got really supportive feedback from my support network was just, it was godsend. And I said to both of them, I'm like, I kind of expect this to happen a few more times. It's almost like with your story, like I'm 43 now, so I'm not in my 20s, 30s, right? So I'm like, I'm not going to get into a relationship with them because I'm going to do all of this beforehand, but I kind of do expect at least a couple more iterations of that, because that's sort of what I'm used to in my process now, is like, oh, I see that, I feel that, I'm attracted to that. No, 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 that's a hot flame. I'm going to say no to that, turn back to myself and look for my version of Damien.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I have a girlfriend when we used to call the same thing that you're talking about sparkly. Like
Mhm.
that person is very sparkly, but sparkly, exactly what you're saying, is like exudes this attraction and this
Mm.
like this forward moving, and you're like under their spell,
Yes.
and that's the heart palpitations, that's the wait, what, why do they have to have that veneer,
Hmm.
is
Hmm.
one question to kind of break your kind of your trance with it.
Hmm.
But yeah, that is, it's such an important thing. And I just want to say something about, there's so many stories. I even mentioned a book and movie. Like there's so many stories and movies and social media posts about, ideal love is like big. You have
Right.
your big movie moment, you have big feelings, you hate the person, you're drawn to the person. And it's like we get these messages that love is this like um, kind of challenging, heart stopping thing. And it's like, no, actually, that's the not good one.
Yeah.
And and yeah, I was just thinking the other day, I'm just on a Pride and Prejudice kick, but I will say if you watch, and Bingley is like his friend who is just like uber really nice and ends up with the older sister who's also really nice. And I'm like, they'd never make a movie out of those two,
Right.
but they are actually the ideal love. Nice people who like each other and are nice to other people.
Hmm.
There's nothing wrong. There's all good things. Shouldn't that be what we're aiming for in all of our relationships, in our friendships, in our parenting relationships, in our, in our colleagues and our employees and staff, like, oh, people doing nice things for each other and being nice to
Hmm.
ourselves, to one another. And so I feel like we need to tell things like that. We need to talk about this so that way we normalize nice
Yes.
or good or open-hearted, as opposed to normalizing like either the sparkly, the snake charmer,
Hmm.
or normalizing being mean and having people like kind of run after you.
Hmm.
And along that line, you mentioned a book, and I'm looking at mine over here, and one of the books that changed how I have relationships is called Facing Love Addiction.
Hmm.
And it's really explains. I hated when that was recommended to me. I like hid in a bookstore to buy it because it's gigantic letters. And I was like, I'm not a love addict. Well, it is explaining kind of the cycle that you can go through. And it's probably attachment stuff. It's like one of you moves towards, the other moves away, and you create this cycle with each other. And I didn't realize that was the cycle from my childhood and the cycle that I was recreating in these heart stopping um, moments. It's like, oh, and to your point about how many you need to go through, I, the there was this fourth person I'd started dating, and I broke things off with him after we had a very fine date. But what I said to him is, I can tell already how we're going to be with each other. That you're going to go away. I'm going to chase after you. You're going to go way further. And then I'm going to be sad. And I don't really want to be sad. So I think we should not see each other again.
Wow.
Yeah. And I was like, oh, I can actually name the cycle and see it. So I applaud you, one, for having a network now, or having a support team that
Mhm.
reflect that to you and support you. And the fact that you are recognizing these things sooner in
Mhm.
yourself and in other people
Mhm.
means that you're moving through that faster
Mhm.
than you
Yep.
may realize.
Yep. It actually started with a secure therapist, and now it's some friends. And even in terms of actual dating, I feel like I need to increase my friend group. And I'm not talking about like 10, 15 friends. I'm like, I have
Right.
3 friends now, and they live across the street. So it's
Yay!
wonderful
Oh,
and
that's
supportive,
awesome.
and they're healthy individuals. But it's too precarious for me to start to weave my life with someone without really having this sort of it's not exactly not a full life, but having those staples in my life to hold me down and support me. So I love all the parallels and all the differences, to be honest. This has been absolutely amazing. Thank you for sharing all of that. So how would people find you to work with you?
Yeah, so my business is called Simply Leap, like leaping, like frog. And the work that we do is about leaping in your career and business. So simplyleap.com is my website. My books, both of my books are there. One is called I'm Scared and Doing It Anyway, and the other is Simply Leap, and my business. 7 lessons on facing fear and enjoying the crap out of your life. Which makes me so happy to say I have to say the subtitle.
Yeah.
And so my information is there, and I'm also on Instagram and Facebook and LinkedIn and wherever else you need to.
I'll put all that stuff in the show notes. Yeah. Amazing. Well, thank you so much. I hope this is just the beginning for us. So thank you for coming.
Oh, thank you. Yes, it was such a pleasure.
Yay. How to Trust Your Intuition, the podcast, is written, produced, and created by me, your host, Betsy LeFae. Music provided by Ben Talmy. If you don't want to be like that pilot that is 80% sure you'll get to your next destination safely, and you want to take the right class to learn the right language, and guess what? Intuition is a language. Head over to howtotrustyourintuition.com. I hope this podcast has been helpful to you. If it has, please forward it to a friend who you think it could also make a difference for. There's something that you can do for me and everyone else who listens to this podcast as well. If you hit subscribe, you'll never miss another episode. It'll also help the show get to other people. And of course, I know you've heard other podcast hosts say this before, but it's totally true. If you leave us a 5-star rating and a review, it helps other people like you discover this podcast. We all need to learn to trust our intuition. So, hit subscribe, give us a 5-star review, and write a little blurb while you're there. Your intuition will thank you.